Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 3, American Federalism, and it's Lesson 15 about the Rights Revolution. In this lesson, you'll learn about 4 Supreme Court cases: Brown versus Board of Education, Texas versus Johnson, Roe v. Wade, and Obergefell versus Hodges, and the impact that these cases had on American federalism. Now, during the last several lessons, we've been learning about how federalism has changed over America's history. And we looked at a series of historical events that contributed to this change. They're not the only events that we could have looked at, but they're particularly prominent events that have altered the balance of power between the national government and the states. In this lesson, we'll be focusing on the Rights Revolution and how it changed the nature of American federalism. The Rights Revolution is a product of a series of United States Supreme Court decisions that began in the 1920s and then really picked up speed in the 1950s and particularly in the 1960s and 1970s, when a Supreme Court that was composed primarily of justices who were willing to use their power to reinterpret the Constitution made use of that power to discover new constitutional rights that had not been thought to be in existence before the Supreme Court said that they were. As we think about the court doing this, please keep in mind that the Supreme Court is actually part of the national government. The reason that is important to recognize is because when you have the Supreme Court discovering new constitutional rights and in effect taking power away from governments when they discover those rights, you have part of the federal system itself, the Supreme Court, which is part of the national government, manipulating the boundaries of the federal system. So it's a party to the federal nature of the American Republic who's then changing the nature of that federal republic. That's a bit problematic for reasons that you should recognize by this point in the course. It's something that we'll talk about more when we eventually talk about the Supreme Court and about civil rights and civil liberties later in this course. We'll talk in a lot more detail then. But for right now, please recognize the problematic nature of a part of the government itself deciding the boundaries of the government in a system where we assume that the power to decide the boundaries of the government belongs with the people rather than with the government itself. So even as we go through the Supreme Court decisions that we're going to look at in this lesson, while you may agree with the outcome of each of them, or you may not, please keep in mind that with each of these decisions that could be producing an outcome that you happen to like, you're endorsing the idea of the Supreme Court using its power to decide where the boundaries of government are. So while in these cases it may decide that the boundaries are places where you think they should be, tomorrow it could use that power that we have essentially given to it to decide that the boundaries should be someplace where you actually don't like. But in a sense, you've lost your right to complain about that when you've accepted them doing things that manipulate the boundaries of power that you happen to approve of. At the same time, you're accepting and manipulating the boundaries of power in ways that you don't approve of. So the particular cases we're going to look at in this lesson are a case about school desegregation, another one about flag burning, one about abortion, and one about same-sex marriage. The school desegregation case took place in 1954. It's the famous Brown versus Board of Education case, probably the most well-known United States Supreme Court decision. And in that case, the Supreme Court decided that separate educational facilities, in other words, schools that were set up where black Americans attended one school and white Americans attended the other, are inherently unequal in violation of the United States Constitution. Prior to rendering this decision, it was believed by the governments in America that they could in fact create separate facilities based on race as long as they treated people equally. So you could have a black high school and a white high school as long as they provided an equivalent education for their students. But then the Supreme Court came along and said, no, you have a right to go to whatever school, regardless of your race. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, you may think that this is a wonderful, morally correct decision. But notice what's happening power-wise when this decision is rendered. Prior to this decision, it would be a state that would decide whether or not to segregate its schools or not. Some states decided to, some states decided not to. Now you have part of the federal government stepping in and telling them that they're not allowed to do it. So in doing this, they create rights for people. People can now go to whatever school, regardless of race. But in doing that, they take power away from states. And it's the national government itself that is taking that power away from them. The next case is a flag burning case. This case took place in the 1980s at a political party convention. There were protesters outside the Republican convention in Dallas when Ronald Reagan was being nominated to be the presidential candidate of the Republican Party. And these protesters burned an American flag. And they were arrested for it because this was a violation of a Texas law that made it a crime to desecrate a symbol like the American flag. The case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court declared then that burning the American flag was protected under the First Amendment as an act of free speech. Now you may wonder about this, and we'll talk about this more later in the course, about how a physical act of burning something is an action of speech. And so don't worry about the reasoning behind that for right now. Just think about the political implications here. Prior to this decision, individual states could pass laws like this if they wanted to. They could prohibit people from doing certain highly offensive things, physical things, such as burning a flag here. After this decision, then that decision is no longer the states to make. Instead, you have part of the national government, the Supreme Court, step here and tell them that there's a constitutional right now to burn a flag. So again, this is one part of the government telling another part of the government what they can and can't do. In the process, it's giving people more rights. Now you can go out and burn flags if you want. You can't be arrested for it. But in doing that, it is taking power away from the state governments. Next case is the abortion case. Abortion referring to a pregnant woman ending her pregnancy by having an abortion doctor remove the fetus from inside her. Now, I don't want to go into the moral debate over abortion here. I just want you to recognize that prior to the Supreme Court rendering a decision in this area, that this was something that was allowed for states to regulate. And every state in the Union had laws regulating when a woman could or could not have an abortion. Some states were much more strict than others, but every state in some way regulated the process. But then in 1973, the Supreme Court declared that women have a right to privacy. Now, you have to recognize that that phrase, right to privacy, doesn't appear anywhere in the Constitution. Prior to a previous decision in the 1960s, there wasn't this concept of a right to privacy as we think of it today. But in this case, they declared that this right to privacy exists, and that it's big enough to insulate and protect a woman's decision whether or not to terminate her pregnancy. Now again, we don't want to debate the morality of this decision. Instead, we just want to concentrate on what it does politically to the powers of government. So prior to this decision, states could decide how they would choose to regulate abortion. After this, now women have a right to decide for themselves whether to get an abortion. And that change was brought about by part of the national government rebalancing the system, so to speak. The next example of the rights revolution that we want to talk about is the issue of same-sex marriage. Same-sex marriage became a very controversial issue in America over the last couple of decades. Almost every state in the country passed some sort of law, or perhaps even an amendment to its state constitution, prohibiting same-sex marriages within their states. But then there was a series of court decisions, beginning with lower courts and then working its way eventually up to the Supreme Court. where various courts around the country began to declare that there was a right, as they saw it, to gay marriage. In other words, it's something that people could do without the government being able to tell them otherwise. When the case eventually reached the Supreme Court in Obergefell versus Hodges in 2015, the Supreme Court decided that gay marriage, same-sex marriage, was a fundamental right that people have under the Constitution that cannot be taken away from them by state governments prohibiting same-sex marriage. So again, we have a situation where now there's individuals that say, hey, I have a right now that I didn't have before. And we don't want to debate the morality of gay marriage, but just focus on what this does to government power. In saying that these individuals now have this right, we're effectively saying that states now have had power removed from them that they previously had before. States could decide this issue, now they can't. And that change has been affected by a decision of the national government. It wasn't because an amendment was passed to the Constitution by the voters. As a matter of fact, the part of the Constitution that this right to gay marriage is supposedly found in was added to the Constitution in 1868. Yet somehow, for almost 150 years, no one noticed that there was a right to same-sex marriage found in that amendment. So effectively, the Supreme Court changed the meaning of that amendment, changed the meaning of the Constitution to add a new right. And the Supreme Court is part of the government itself that's doing that, rather than we, the people, passing the amendment to do it. So what does this do to the balance of power within our country's federal system? Well, prior to these rights revolutions decisions, this is the diagram that we had to illustrate the powers of the national government and the states. Now remember, this is after several other developments. The implied powers that we got from McCulloch versus Maryland and the Hamiltonian economic system, the Civil War amendments, the expansion of power under interpretations of the Commerce Clause in the New Deal and the Great Society. We have a greatly then expanded power of the national government and a diminished power of the states being illustrated here. So what does the rights revolution then do? It further diminishes the power of the states. Now, things are getting kind of cramped in this diagram, so I can't really show something else that's happening here at the same time. And that is that while the power of the states is being further contracted to give people rights that they didn't have before, the entity that's invoking that contraction on the states is the national government itself through the Supreme Court, which is part of the national government. So at the same time that the power of the states is being diminished, the power of the national government is in fact actually growing. And for that reason, we have to ask ourselves, is this the true state of American federalism then? Has the national government's power expanded to the point that it completely covers up the state power? Now, notice I say covers up the state power because that white circle representing the power of the states is still there. It's just now entirely covered up by the national government. Now, what that means is states are still doing things, but the national government has claimed authority over those exact same things. And the reason that matters so much is the supremacy clause. So if the United States government legitimately passes a law in an area and it conflicts with a state power, the national government's law is the supreme law of the land and dominates and dictates to the states what they can and can't do. So on the previous slide I had a question mark. Is that really the true state of American federalism? That the national government has completely swamped the power of the states? Well, it's an important question to consider, and we'll consider it more in the next lesson. So now, let's review. What right was discovered in the case of Brown versus Board of Education? Was it a right to a reduced national government, or to the preservation of state powers, or to no sexual discrimination, or to no racial segregation? It was a right to no racial segregation, initially just in schools, but then applied to other areas. What right was discovered in Texas versus Johnson? Was it a right to flag burning, or draft dodging, or pot smoking, or to have health insurance provided for you? It was a right to burn a flag as an act of free speech, as the Supreme Court would say. What right was discovered in Roe v. Wade? Was it a right to birth control, a right to sodomy, a right to abortion, a right to in vitro fertilization. It was a right to abortion that the Supreme Court declared in Roe v. Wade for the entire country, which ended up striking down abortion laws in all 50 states. What right was discovered in Obergefell versus Hodges? Was it a right to interracial marriage, a right to union organizing, a right to same-sex marriage, or a right to a public education? That case discovered a right to same-sex marriage. All right, that does it for this lesson. The next lesson from Unit 3 will be Lesson 16 about New Federalism.